and welcome to History 300, The Origins of the First World War. Lecture 5, Formation of the Alliances, 1870 to 1907, and the European Balance of Power. In the last two lectures, we introduced ourselves to the great powers of Europe as they existed in 1914, and also took a particular look at the southeastern portion of Europe known as the Balkans, in which the crisis that began the First World War took place. In this lecture, we're going to examine the diplomatic relationships between the great powers in the years leading up to the war, and in particular, at the various alliance arrangements that had come into existence. On maps of 1914 Europe, you'll often see the continent's great powers divided into two alliance groups of 3 members each, known as the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, respectively. In fact, the alliance system was rather more complicated than that simple division suggests. The Triple Alliance fell apart even before the first shots of the war were fired, and the Triple Entente wasn't really an alliance at all in any formal sense. The alliances that really mattered in 1914 were the bilateral relationships that existed between Germany and Austria-Hungary on the one hand, and France and Russia on the other. Britain's bilateral relationships with France and Russia were also very important. But Britain was not allied with either of these countries, and during the July crisis there was a considerable degree of uncertainty shared by everyone as to what obligation, if any, Britain had to its European partners. Before I talk in detail about the alliances, I should say something first about the concept of the balance of power, which we'll see plenty of references to in the literature that follows. The balance of power can be understood in both a descriptive and a prescriptive sense. That is, some people regarded it simply as a way of explaining how the world worked, while others believed that it showed how the world ought to work. In a descriptive sense, the balance of power was the idea that great powers had a tendency to combine together in order to prevent any of them from becoming so powerful that it could exercise unfettered control or hegemony over all of Europe. Or, to put it in slightly more prescriptive terms, the best way of ensuring international peace and stability was for the great powers to align themselves in such a way that they cancelled one another out. If one great power, or an alliance of great powers, ever seemed as though it might be in a position to exercise hegemony, it was in the best interests of all the other great powers to provide a counterbalance by pooling their strength. In a way, you can think about the balance of power and hegemony as operating in the same manner as free market pricing and monopoly pricing operate in the commercial world. Every business insists that it is in favour of prices being set by supply and demand, though secretly it would really like to exercise monopoly power if it could. Similarly, in 1914, every great power declaimed in public that it was committed to the idea of the balance of power, even though, in an ideal world, it would have loved to have exercised hegemony for itself. The balance of power, then, was a kind of consolation prize. If you could not be the hegemon, at least you could also deny every other power the chance of being the hegemon too. There had been occasions in the European past at which some great powers really had made a bid for hegemony. Philip II of Spain had come close to it in the late 16th century, as had France's Louis XIV 100 years later, and Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 19th century. In each case, the other great powers had eventually been able to combine and prevent the bid from succeeding. In 1940, Adolf Hitler would make the last ever serious bid for European hegemony and would come dangerously close to achieving it. Was Kaiser Wilhelm's Imperial Germany's decision to declare war on Russia and France in 1914 also a bid for hegemony? As we'll see, the answer to that question lies at the heart of understanding the origins of the First World War. After 1918, the whole balance of power system was condemned by some critics as one of the main reasons why the war had begun in the first place. American President Woodrow Wilson blamed Europe's culture of secret diplomacy and rival alliances for exacerbating tensions between the great powers. And he thought his League of Nations would provide an alternative way of ensuring international peace by creating an open and impartial forum for the discussion and resolution of diplomatic conflicts. Some historians have also blamed the pre-war alliance system for starting the war. The argument is that the alliance arrangements turned what otherwise would have been a localized, regional dispute in the Balkans in 1914 into a continental-wide war by a kind of unstoppable chain reaction. So as Austria and Russia came to blows, Germany found itself embroiled because of its alliance with Austria, and then France too came to be involved because of its alliance with Russia, and so on. It's interesting, though, that before the First World War, many people had exactly the opposite view. They believed that the alliance system actually made war less likely because it had a restraining effect on the great powers. The argument went that because each great power would have to justify its actions to its alliance partners, and that they would not want to be dragged into war on some flimsy pretext that had no bearing on their own self-interests, a great power committed to an alliance would have to act with greater caution and self-discipline than it otherwise would have, or else risk wrecking its relationship with its allies. As the Times of London put it in April 1914, alliances were good because they generated a sense of responsibility which chastened and restrained the boldest. They ensured that the great powers were no longer unfettered judges in their own cause, answerable to none but themselves. Certainly, in the years before the First World War, alliance members were always complaining that they did not get the support that they thought they deserved from their partners. The Russians griped that the French didn't back them up sufficiently in the Balkans crisis of 1913, for instance. The Austrians said the same thing about the Germans that year. Although most of the great powers took their alliance responsibilities seriously, they also distinguished their interests from their legal commitments, and they were willing to ignore the latter if they seemed to clash with the former. The Italians, for instance, simply walked away from the Triple Alliance in 1914 when its terms no longer suited them. By contrast, the British government had no legal obligation to the French or Russians at all in 1914, yet in the event it decided to intervene in the war anyway, because it concluded that Britain's interests demanded it. So while we need to consider the alliances seriously, we should not exaggerate their binding nature or suggest that they were the only factor which mattered in a crisis. Okay, let's now consider some of the peacetime alliances in a bit more detail. The oldest great power alliance in Europe in 1914 was the German-Austrian Alliance, or the so-called Dual Alliance, which had been originally signed in 1879. Its essential point was that if either Germany or Austria was ever attacked by Russia, then each would come to the other's aid with the whole strength of their empires. Additionally, the alliance also stipulated that if either of the partners was ever attacked by a great power aside from Russia, France was the obvious candidate here, then the other partner would, at the very least, remain neutral in the ensuing war. Although by 1914 the German-Austrian alliance had been in place for 35 years, when it was originally signed it took the rest of Europe somewhat by surprise, because Berlin and Vienna had traditionally been rivals rather than partners. Indeed, they had gone to war with one another as recently as 1866. But the Austrians were well aware by the late 1870s that they were falling behind the other great powers, and the treaty provided them with some valuable security should they ever end up in a conflict with Russia over the Balkans. For Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor, the value of the dual alliance was somewhat different. Far from being an encouragement to the Austrians to meddle in Balkan affairs, he actually saw it as a way of controlling them. Remember the Times talking about chastening and restraining the boldest? And it would prevent them from doing anything foolishly provocative. Also, he did not necessarily see the alliance as anti-Russian. If anything, he saw it as a way of encouraging the Russians to be friendlier towards Germany, by illustrating to them how futile and self-defeating it would be to threaten the Austrians. Indeed, in the long term, Bismarck saw the dual alliance neither as a permanent arrangement necessarily, nor even as Germany's most important potential alliance relationship. In 1887, in fact, without the knowledge of the Austrians, he signed a secret deal with the Russians, known as the Reinsurance Treaty, which stated that the two countries would remain neutral in the event that one of them went to war with a third great power, the only exceptions to this being if Germany attacked France or if Russia attacked Austria. This technically didn't violate the terms of the dual alliance, but it certainly went against its spirit, because it meant that if Austria ever declared war on Russia, it could expect no assistance from Germany. Fortunately for the Austrians, however, After Bismarck fell from power in 1890, the reinsurance treaty was not renewed. This was not because the Germans were turning anti-Russian necessarily, but simply because they felt that they didn't need a treaty to handle their relationship with St. Petersburg. Kaiser Wilhelm was, after all, Tsar Nicholas's older cousin, and he rather patronisingly assumed that he could always control his younger kinsman. Plus, the Germans felt it was not as though the Russians had anyone else to turn to. Who were they going to ally with? Britain? France? The idea was simply too preposterous to worry about in 1890. We'll see how that complacent assumption worked out in a moment. Before we get to that, however, I should round out the discussion of the dual alliance by describing its transformation into the Triple Alliance in 1882. This was when the Kingdom of Italy allied itself to Germany and Austria-Hungary, each of them agreeing that it would provide military assistance if either of the others was attacked by a third great power. Italy was not a particularly powerful ally to have, but the appeal of the Triple Alliance from Bismarck's point of view was that it would make life difficult for the French, knowing that they had a vulnerable border on the southeast. The Italians saw the Triple Alliance as offering them support in their colonial rivalry with France in North Africa. Both of them at the time were jockeying to seize Ottoman territory along the Mediterranean shoreline. Also, the Italian government had very poor relations with the Vatican, and it was hoped that it might be able to do some bridge building with the Pope by allying itself with Emperor Franz Joseph, the most senior Catholic monarch in Europe. But the Triple Alliance was always an unnatural thing. By the early 20th century, the French and Italians had largely patched up their differences in North Africa, making the treaty redundant from that perspective. And the fact was that the Austrians and Italians loathed one another. Italy had territorial ambitions in the Tyrol and along the Adriatic coast of the Balkans that directly conflicted with Austrian interests. By 1914, it was an open secret that the Italians had no interest in fulfilling the terms of their alliance commitment. The Austrian Army Chief of Staff called the Triple Alliance a pointless farce, and took it for granted that if Austria ever went to war again, it would be attacked by the Italians sooner or later. And that is indeed what actually happened. Only the Austro-German Dual Alliance contained within the Triple Alliance actually mattered in the event. The other great bilateral alliance of 1914 was the Franco-Russian Alliance, originally drafted in 1892 and finally ratified in 1894. If the signing of the Dual Alliance in 1879 had raised some eyebrows, the treaty between France and Russia left people with their mouths agape. It was the most extraordinary development in European diplomatic memory. The Republic of France and the Russian Empire were at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. Remember, the French openly celebrated the killing of their king in 1793, while according to the Russians, the Tsar was God's own representative on earth. Bismarck and his successors took it completely for granted that these two states could never, ever come to terms. Yet in October 1896, Tsar Nicholas travelled to Paris to cement the new arrangement, and was watched by a crowd of millions as he stood stiffly to attention as the French national anthem La Marseillaise was played. Until recently, it had been a criminal offence to play this tune back in Russia. It was as though at the height of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan had travelled to Moscow and remarked that he had always been a staunch admirer of Soviet communism. But the logic of the alliance was simply too strong to allow for ideological qualms. For the French, gaining Russia as an ally meant that if it was ever attacked by Germany, the German advantage in numbers would be more than made up for by the massive Russian army that would come steamrolling in from the east. For the Russians, isolated after the expiration of the reinsurance treaty, the alliance provided a counterweight to the Germans in the west, and would give Russia a freer hand in southeastern Europe because, so the thinking went anyway, the Germans would be less eager to support the Austrians in a Balkan dispute. Perhaps even more important, the treaty guaranteed a flow of badly needed French capital investment into Russia. Indeed, the French flooded Russia with cheap loans in order for the Russians to have the money to modernise their armed forces and expand the strategic railroads they would need in the event of mobilisation. For the Germans, the signing of the Franco-Russian Alliance was a disaster, and it played a huge role in the drawing up of their subsequent military plans, as we'll see in the next lecture. The last great power we need to consider is Britain. Until the beginning of the 20th century, Britain had no interest in a formal peacetime alliance with any of the other European great powers. It felt it could look after its own affairs, protected by its offshore location and its naval supremacy in the North Sea and the English Channel. It enjoyed what it called splendid isolation from the petty squabbles of the continent. But by 1900, this isolation was starting to look less splendid. The Boer War in South Africa, which had broken out the previous year, ended in victory for Britain, but was a much more expensive and drawn-out affair than its government had originally expected, and the lack of support from the rest of Europe was telling. Moreover, other powers, especially Germany, were building their own fleets in order to challenge the absolute supremacy of the Royal Navy, and with Britain's industrial economy no longer as dominant as it had once been, it was clear that the British could not simply outbuild everyone. So a less complacent attitude had to be adopted. In 1902, Britain signed a treaty with Japan, basically aimed against Russia, which allowed it to withdraw most of its fleet in East Asia and the Pacific for use elsewhere. But what was really needed was a European partner. For a time, there was some serious discussion about an alliance with Germany, but this ultimately got nowhere, because the Germans would have insisted as a precondition that if nothing else, Britain agree to remain neutral in the event of a Franco-German war, and this seemed to fly in the face of the balance of power principle. Germany was the strongest continental power by the turn of the 20th century, and the British worried that it would most likely defeat an unassisted France in the West. That would open up the highly unpleasant possibility of a German bid for outright hegemony in Europe. So the path was laid for the Anglo-French Entente, or the Entente Cordiale, as it was known, which was agreed in 1904. The Entente Cordiale was one of those agreements that gradually became something it wasn't originally conceived or intended to be, at least by the British. England and France had a well-known history of mutual antagonism, stretching all the way back to the 14th century. They had fought almost continuously from 1689 to 1815. Even as recently as 1898, they had been involved in a major diplomatic spat over control of the Upper Nile in Africa, which some people worried might end in war. But politicians on both sides of the English Channel could see by 1904 that the rise of Germany potentially threatened both countries. So it made sense, if nothing else, to try to resolve some of their old colonial differences. The Entente Cordiale, then, was an agreement that France acknowledged Great Britain's control of Egypt, and in return, Britain would recognise French claims in Morocco. There were also some sidebar agreements about Siam, Indochina, and Burma. And to begin with, that's all the Entente Cordiale was. However, as the relationship between the two powers warmed, it seemed to make sense for them to talk more about possible cooperation in a future war. British staff officers visited France to discuss with their French counterparts how they might theoretically fight a war against Germany. As these discussions became more detailed, the British mapped out a plan to send an expeditionary force to France in the event of war to take up position along the French Channel coast. Also, the two powers agreed to divide naval responsibilities, so Britain would defend the English Channel and the North Sea, while France would secure the Mediterranean. Over time, these agreements became increasingly hard-coded into French military plans, so much so that if Britain pulled out of them at the last minute, it would leave France in a very, very dangerous position and would ruin Anglo-French relations, perhaps permanently. So even though they involved no legal commitment, there was perhaps a moral commitment that was being made. But Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, had to be very discreet about this, because he knew that many of his own colleagues in the Liberal government would be appalled to think that Britain was committing itself to some kind of secret alliance with France. This was the problem with the Entente. Over time, it started to become an alliance in all but a legal sense, an alliance that dared not speak its name, with a dangerous fuzziness to it. As one of Grey's deputies, Eyre Crowe, summed it up, "An entente is nothing more than a frame of mind, a view of general policy, which may become so vague as to lose all content." The Entente Cordiale was followed by a similar, though less intense, Anglo-Russian Entente in 1907. In some ways, this was even more unlikely than the Entente Cordiale had been. For although Britain's rivalry with Russia was not as old as its rivalry with France, it had recently been much more intense. The two states had been at war from 1853 to 56 and had engaged in a Cold War standoff throughout much of the later 19th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, the so-called Eastern Question we talked about last time, and on the frontier between Afghanistan and India. In 1905, when Russia and Britain's ally Japan had gone to war, a Russian fleet travelling from the Baltic to the Pacific via the North Sea had accidentally attacked a British fishing fleet, causing a huge row between the two countries. But as the Anglo-French Entente began to slowly consolidate into an unwritten alliance, it made little sense for Great Britain to continue to be at loggerheads with France's continental ally. For Russia, too, an agreement with Britain would mean it could concentrate its forces against Germany. So just as the British had done with the French in 1904, in 1907 they drew up an agreement with the Russians to settle some long-standing colonial disagreements. Specifically, to divide Persia, modern-day Iran, into two spheres of influence, and to settle their differences over Afghanistan and Tibet. The Anglo-Russian Entente never went as far as the Anglo-French one, but by 1914 it had removed many old anxieties and suspicions. That then was the alliance situation as it existed on the eve of the First World War. We shouldn't assume, however, that Europe by that date was divided into two hopelessly irreconcilable camps. Certainly, there was a good deal of suspicion on both sides, but in some circumstances it remained possible for even rival alliance members to cooperate with one another. The French and Russians were able to work with the Germans on matters concerning China, for instance. The British and Germans cooperated on a possible deal to divide up the Portuguese colonies in Africa and to create a railroad which would link Constantinople with Baghdad. Plus, pan-alliance diplomacy was still possible. In 1912, Sir Edward Grey was able to bring representatives of all the great powers together to work out a plan for the Balkans, which seemed, at the time, to settle many of the old disputes in the region. Indeed, Grey's negotiations were so successful that some observers in 1914 thought that the relations between the great powers were less fraught than they had been for many years. Complicating this benign picture, however, was the European arms race. In the next lecture, we'll look at the state of military preparedness in 1914 and the various military plans that the great powers were committed to. See you then.